everybody, and welcome back to part 2 of my Return of the Archon series. It is I, Tom, the very lowest of men, reinstated Drukhari main, and I am here to talk all things Drukhari with you today. If you missed part 1, I talked about my return to playing Drukhari with Sky Splinter, practice figuring out the new detachment, and some thoughts going into a series of events that I've now played. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. And if you are interested in supporting the channel, please do hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, and you can sign up now on YouTube to be a member as well. Today, I'm going to be talking about my win at the Saffron Slam GT. So let's get into it and start talking about all that Drukhari good stuff. So the structure is going to be as follows. I'm going to talk about my event expectations going in, what I was expecting, what I was thinking with this particular environment, the Saffron Slam. Then I'm going to move to cover my list as it was at that stage. And then we're going to go through the rounds one at a time. And we've got Demons round 1, Marines round 2, Tyranids round 3, Death Guard round 4, and finally the final against Grey Knights. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of post-event analysis as well. And what I'm going to try and do with each round is give you some thoughts on the matchups, some thoughts on the missions, some thoughts on the play styles, because they're a little bit different each time, and really try and give you the kind of inside view of how I was approaching my games and going about the event on my way to the eventual win, which was a lovely surprise and my first GT win in 10th edition, which was bloody wonderful. Really happy with that. So, event expectations. So Saffron Slam is a GT local to me in Saffron Walden, and it is a competitive event, but it's also very community minded. It's run by Lewis Elms, one of our own 6++ members, and Lewis puts a real emphasis on fair play, sportsmanship, having a welcoming and inviting community that looks after players of all the different standards, and he has terrain that reflects that range of interests as well, right? Saffron Slam tends to have a bunch of thematic boards on the lower tables, presenting their own quite unique challenges. And then he has UKTC for the sort of top few tables. So once you make it up to those final games, you're usually playing on more standardized UKTC style terrain. So you need to be able to manage different types of terrain on your way there and then be able to handle the UKTC boards once you get into that stronger position as well. Saffron Slam has a very strong cohort of local players that attend, but typically people will experiment with different kinds of armies and lists. A good example would be Jack Tite, who brought Pure Corn Demons rather than his sister's list, which I'm sure would have just won the event straight up. So there's a mix of armies in play at Saffron. You don't see as much of the pure kind of top of the meta armies, but you do see plenty of very strong lists piloted by strong players. So there's a good challenge there, but perhaps a more diverse and interesting scene, both boards and armies-wise, than you might get at some of the larger events in the UK. So that's one of the things I love about it, and it's why I always try to take something interesting. In this case, Drukhari had just dropped, so it was a brand new kind of adventure for me, and I had no idea where it would sit. But my anticipation was that this wouldn't be a kind of unpleasant or broken experience for people to play into. So it was my first event with the new detachment. I'd played a few games. I had a couple of wins, a couple of losses, and I'd learned a lot already. But I think when you have a list you're not that experienced with, it's very sensible to have reasonable expectations, right? I know I backed myself as a player in this kind of environment, and I was fairly confident I'd be able to win more than I lost, games-wise. But actually, the main goal was learning, figuring the detachment out, starting to get a fix on how it played into different matchups. And I was entirely content to recognize that might mean I hit a couple of things that I just don't know how to deal with yet, and have a slightly worse run as a result. And I was entirely at peace with that, which is why it was a good environment to sort of get back on the horse, as it were, with the Drukhari. The list was covered in more depth, and my thinkings on the detachment in more depth in part 1. But just to reiterate, this was quite a melee-focused Drukhari build, taking Lilith, triple Archon, one with Shroud, one with Raider, and a Beastmaster. I had some Witches, some Cabalites. I had 20 Incubi, bloody love Incubi, one big 10 brick and 2 5s, a couple of 5s of Mandrakes for scoring, a 5 of Racks for pain token regen and just utility on points, 2 squads of 5 Dark Lance Scourge, 1 squad of 5 Haywire Scourge for anti-tank, a Kronos, a Ravager with Dark Lances, 2 Raiders to ferry the larger units in, and 3 Venoms. So this is a list that can play a range of different ways, and as we'll see in the matchups and the missions, I play it very differently depending on what I'm playing into. It can be very expansive and aggressive, but it can also bide its time and wait to push a counterattack later in the game. One of the things I really like to do with the 20 Incubi is have 1 5-man and a Venom in the sky, so that I can use rapid ingress in a key moment in the game to drop that down and push for a weak point in the opponent's defenses, steal a backfield objective, or hit them in the flank. And I think that means you still have enough melee threat on the board in Lilith and 15 other Incubi to keep the opponent very honest and keep them in front of you, but gives you that really damaging precision threat of an Incubi squad coming out of a Venom up in the sky with proper deep strike, so it's very hard to screen and stop it from finding a point with the enormous reach that the new stratagem to move and disembark gives you. This keeps the opponent on the back foot, and I really like with Drukhari in general identifying a point in the mid game where I can sort of swing for the fences and try and put my opponent away. And I felt that the melee version of the list that I'd settled on has a lot of output, a lot of strength, still got plenty of scoring, but is very good at springing the offense at a key moment. And this definitely happens a few times in my game. So I like the list a lot. It's probably the closest reflection of how I enjoy Drukhari and Sky Splinter, and I was really excited to play it. So I got a strong player round one. This was the lovely Jack Sayer, who ended up placing, I think, third at the event. Jack Sayer plays for Black Crow Gaming. He's a very strong player, and he's also a lovely sporting guy, and we had a really, really fun game. Now, Chaos Demons are what Jack was running, and Chaos Demons, like Drukhari, have had some buffs. And I actually think in the last couple of weeks since the data slate, Demon players have started to stumble on a formula that really, really works. And I think it's centered a lot more around Greaton Clean Ones and Blood Crushers, big slabs of stats. But this was an earlier draft of Chaos Demons post-slate that Jack was running. So it doesn't have quite as much of the things that I think actually make the matchup very scary for Drukhari in it. He has Bellicle, he has Scarbrand, he had a Keeper, Shalaxi, who's amazing obviously, but very expensive. Lots of Nurglings for scoring, Horrors, and Plague Bearers. The mission we played was Vital Ground, which means the primary is concentrated on the two middle objectives or holding your opponent's back objective. Sitting back is not going to help you here. You don't get much for holding your home objective. You need to go and play the game. We're on Search and Destroy deployment, which gives a lot of space to move around and spread along the flanks and find space to attack the opponent. And I got the first turn. Now, with Drukhari in general, I think they're an army that likes being on second turn because they're good at primary denial, but they're not good at holding primary themselves. You can play very passively if you have the second turn because you can hold off, keep the opponent's score down, then win on a big swing at the end of the game. That isn't an option when you have the first turn as Drukhari very often, which in this case meant I went for a game plan I'm going to call proactive/disruptive. I know that demons have the ability to jump up and jump down in different places and hit me in my soft parts. I can't stop them doing this. What I can do is use the huge width of assets that I have, the absolute mass of rubbish, nasty little units and transports, to flood the board, go and attack as many points as I possibly can, and force the demons to split up. Bellicle obviously makes it hard for me to shoot the demons if they stay close to him, but if I create a situation where I'm threatening in 3 different places, the demons have to start splitting away from Bellicle, at which point they're easier to deal with. Particularly things like the Keeper and Shalaxi are not actually as tough against things like Dark Lances or Incubi if I get into them. So in this game, using the first turn, I pushed very aggressively, used the Beast Pack to go and sit on one point on one flank and draw the demons out so I could counterattack, and then waited for an in on the other side after locking down one flank quite decisively with lots of transports that the demons couldn't open without any reasonable shooting to do it. And Jack in turn used his jumping up and jumping down to come and try and take my backfield objective, which is obviously worth a lot of points. Now Jack fails a charge, which means it takes him an extra turn to get there with Scarbrand, which is definitely makes this look like a less close game than it was. This was a razor tight and very tough game. And in reply, in round 2, I then rapid ingress the Venom, as aforementioned, and steal his back objective with 5 Incubi and an Archon. There's a few peaky moments in this game that I think highlight why it's actually quite a rough matchup for Drukhari, which is that the greater demons, if they don't die, your pain token economy completely collapses. If you invest effort to kill them and then you fall short, you can find yourself running dry on pain tokens. And I was definitely struggling until I was able to pick up some Nurgling squads and things like the Horrors and the Plague Bearers to help get me some points in the game, pain tokens wise. And the other thing is that the battle shock test that Incubi force when they go into combat can end up healing the demons here. So you have to watch out for that. You have to factor in a few regained wounds into your efforts to try and slay demon units, because that battle shock can end up working against you in this matchup, which is obviously a really funny interaction that Jack and I had a real laugh with. I definitely turned this into a game where I was just forcing the issue everywhere, which meant Jack was fighting a lot of different fires and struggled to sort of outmaneuver all the different assets that I have, and he got bogged down And eventually assets like the Keeper and Shalaxi went down. I think Scarbrand and Bellicourt might have made it to the end, I can't remember. But because I'd killed the rest and had kept Jack's primary down constantly across the game, he wasn't able to recover it, despite being on the second turn. So this was an 83-58 win. I think the new Demons builds we're seeing, where there's triple Great Unclean One profiles, there's Blood Crusher stacks, these are much rougher for Drukhari because, again, they really aggravate that pain token problem. Great Unclean Ones are toughness 12, so suddenly Dark Lances become extremely swingy and peaky, and they just have a lot more wounds, which makes things like Incubi going into them really dangerous and really peaky. So I think this is one where the innovation I've seen from players like Jack since is going to cause even more problems for Drukhari, and I wouldn't go into Demons thinking it's a good matchup. But if you go into a Demons greater monster spam where the monsters are in that T11, T10 kind of bracket, I think we've got the great tools for it, and you just have to strip down their assets and outmuscle them with the sheer number of stuff that you have. So that was a really good quality of game to start things off, and it was a pleasure to meet and play Jack for the first time. Round 2, I played against Darm on his Ultramarines. Now, Darm is a slightly more casual player, I think, and he had a beautifully painted Ultramarines army. It was Gladius, and he had a lot of nice tools in there. He had Hellblasters, some Gladiator tanks, the Aggressor Calgar bomb, which is very scary, and then, usual kinds of utility like infiltrators and scouts and these kinds of things. The mission was interesting. It was the Ritual, and we were on quite a thematic board, as the last game was also on a fairly thematic board, where there was some nice ruins for staging and hiding, but actually the map itself had plenty of shooting lanes, and with the Ritual, where you're going to be having to make objectives in certain specific places out in the open, it's quite peaky because it's going to be quite easy for the opponent to push and get good shooting angles on those locations. Crucible of Battle deployment, again, I think Drukhari really like any of the sort of diagonals deployments because that's where your speed really tells. And on this one, I was on the second turn, which actually was good for me because I did have a good aggressive option to go into Darm early. But I think with so many guns and so many assets available, my preference was to wait and see what he did with them and look for opportunities to counterattack. So I went for a reactive/defensive game plan here. I'm going to hide. I'm going to start building objectives. I'm going to see what Darm shows me. I've got, again, a Venom up in the sky, and I am ready to jump and counter push. Now, Darm played this very aggressively. He pushed up very hard. Couldn't really get angles on anything except the Beast Pack, which, again, when you go second, one of the things you can do with the Beast Pack rather than hide it is just push it out to get their shooting onto it so that you can then counterattack with Dark Lances, Incubi, everything else. So I used the Beast Pack as bait here. And it's bait that Darm went for. He committed Hellblasters, he committed some of his tanks, and I then counterattacked very heavily even in my turn 1 because he got that close, and hit the Hellblasters and killed all of those with Incubi and took out one of the tanks. Darm's then in a difficult position and he pushes further, wants to try and recover the situation, so he pushes even more aggressively, kills a bit more stuff, but then my counterattack in turns 2 and 3 really cripples the Ultramarines list here. So this was one where I think Darm had very good guns, could have been a lot more patient, and could have also played the kind of build objectives and wait kind of game, and he opted not to do that, and he came too close. And what I like about Sky Splinter now and Drukhari in general is that if someone plays too confidently and too assertively into you, you can punish that brutally. So very important lessons there. We had a lovely game. Darm was a really lovely guy. And we talked a lot about how he could approach the game differently afterwards. So it was a real pleasure to meet and play him. Thank you very much, Darm. Storming Drukhari winning. It was like 95-36. Next up, we have a round 3 game. This is into Tyranids, and I'm playing against Sam. Now, Sam is a very strong local player, and he does very well on all sorts of Horde, Xenos-type armies. That's his favourite. So I knew this was a very tough game, and Sam was playing Invasion Fleet Tyranids, which is probably my favourite way to play Tyranids, because you get that nice mix of monsters and chaff. So he's got a lot of big bugs, Exocrines, Maliceptors, Hive Tyrant, those kinds of things. But then he has the good supporting chaff, Neurolictors, Pure Strain Gene Stealers, which I really rate. I think they're a really nice little unit at the moment, and suitable numbers of gargoyles for draping all over the primary and shutting down score. So Nids are an interesting one for Drukhari because they can really drown us, they can shut off our scoring, and they can make life really difficult. The mission was Scorched Earth, so this helps me in some ways because the primary reward was actually less, and if you can lock down 2 points, you can score pretty well. Hammer and Anvil deployment probably favoured the Nids. It didn't give me space to get round them, and I was also on first turn. So that means I have to be aggressive and I have to be assertive. I can't hold off. And with the map and with the huge amount of Tyranid stuff in front of me, my game plan was to get the army sort of firmly set up and then push very aggressively in turns 2 through 4 and just start killing bugs as much as I possibly could and using the kind of get back in transport capacity, get back in venoms, use the strat to get back into a raider to make sure I wasn't losing too much of my cutting edge in the incubi in particular, as these were the things that were going to help me get through the enemy units. And this, I think, was going really well. I think in general, this was a very tight game. I do think Tyranids is very tough for Drukhari, but I think I was putting away the Tyranids very quickly. I had made some misplays. I'd gave up Lilith and her squad too early when they should have sat in a building undercover and just held a point. And so I definitely was down a little on assets. But by turn 4, I was definitely pulling away on remaining assets on the board, and the Tyranids started to run out of puff. Now, there were a few moments in this game. We had a little misunderstanding between Sam and I over OC count on a point, which meant Sam thought he'd denied primary, but actually he hadn't because he'd misplayed it. But we talked through it and realised there was things he could have done to adjust it, so we adjusted it because that's Saffron Slam, and I'm not looking to catch anyone out that way, and I didn't want to do him like that. And we also, unfortunately, in this game, there's a lot of stuff on the board with Drukhari and Tyranid, so we ran out of time at the end of turn 4. Now, we got to 72-72, and honestly, it had been a really good back and forth game. Sam had used things like the gargoyles and the pure strains really well and given me all sorts of problems. And although I felt like I had the momentum for turn 5, you can never actually know in 40k. And I didn't feel comfortable saying I was in a good position if I didn't actually know. So we took a 72-all draw, and that felt like a really nice, positive reflection on the match. And at the time, from where we were sitting, felt like it was very much in the spirit of the event as well. And I think Sam ended up taking second place at this overall. So very well done to Sam. Pleasure to play you in person for the first time. So I then went away and had a break, and it was Sunday morning, and I was drawn into another tough matchup, which was round 4 against the Death Guard. Now, Josh French, who plays Death Guard, he's a South Africa international, so he's another one of the strong players locally. He's a really funny guy. I've played him before. I lost to his Chaos Knights, and he's always an absolute joy to play. He's very funny, very witty, very sarcastic, and just has a real knack for the game that I really enjoy as well. Now, he was experimenting with Death Guard, I suspect, for South Africa research, and he was trying Mortarion, triple Plague Burst Crawlers, some Bloat Drones, a Rhino with some Plague Marines, and some Death Shroud for deep striking in as well. The mission was Sites of Power on Sweeping Engagement. Now, Sites of Power gives you additional primary if you hold objectives with characters. This is quite interesting for both the Death Guard and the Drukhari because we both have a bunch of units with characters in. I think the issue for the Drukhari is that theirs are usually going out to kill something and then die, whereas the Death Guard ones are often hiding and staging and doing secondaries and whatever else, and can get you quite a lot of primary quite passively on this mission. I then also got first turn. With the artillery in Death Guard, you are on a timer. I talked about this in part 1. They very much have the tools and the capacity to demech you and kill things like your Scourge over a few turns, so you don't have time to waste, and you need to be very proactive in the game. So my game plan here can only be described as hyper-aggression. Josh gave me a lovely play here, which is that he'd loaded up one flank with PBCs and Morty to swing around and attack my sort of safer side of the board. And I deployed Mandrakes in a building in cover on that flank. And with the Beastmaster, I was able to rush up on that side and just block that entire line of movement off. So the PBCs couldn't get out. This was on UKTC type terrain. PBCs couldn't get forwards. Mortarion couldn't get out. He had to go backwards. And that turned that entire flank, which meant an area that was actually quite vulnerable for me could be secured and locked down for a couple of turns, and I was able to get some primary. I pushed very aggressively with the Incubi and with the Witches, with my Raiders and Venoms. And I accepted a couple of losses here to the shooting from the Death Guard because my calculation was that if I lost a Venom and an Archon squad dropped on a point in this mission, the primary reward was actually such that if I could build up a decent lead from casualties early on, this was well worth it. So this was an old school Drukhari game where I was really taking heavy attrition, heavy losses, getting hurt very brutally, but blocking the Death Guard in and pushing them repeatedly back off the centre so they couldn't score their primary for the first 2 or 3 turns of the game. Obviously, Death Guard are very durable, and they proved it here. Mortarion is not something Drukhari can very easily kill. And Josh pulled his Death Shroud reserves in and hit me on my flank and broke through eventually in sort of turns 4 and 5. But because I blocked him in, forced him to double back on himself and controlled the kind of centre of the board for a couple of crucial turns with my assets as they sort of died for the cause, I'd built up enough primary lead and secondary lead because the Death Guard again struggled to score because they couldn't get out of their kind of side for a little while. That meant that the Drukhari took this 81-65. Josh took this like an absolute gent, bought me a beer, as is his way. I really, really enjoyed it. And it was a pleasure to talk about all sorts of international team stuff with him after the game. So thank you very much, Josh. I think Death Guard is one of those matchups where I can see Drukhari losing this as often as they win it. We have a lot of tools to really hurt Death Guard. Splinter Cannons from Venoms are no joke for Plague Marines. But the Dark Lance game into big tanks is tough, and with the mortars, they definitely have the tools to wear you down and leave you with very little left on the board. So it's a swingy matchup, but it's one I've played a couple of times now, and Drukhari definitely can and do win it. So that then takes us through to round 5. So this is the final against Grey Knights, piloted by Harley Scully. Now, Harley has joined Plus because he's a gentleman, and I'm getting several Dread Knights. Which are just into vogue. Grey Knights are incredibly hard to pin down. Terminators themselves are very, very tough for Drukhari to deal with. What the mission in this case was supply drop. So this is one where the objectives start disappearing in the middle, and there's an enormous endgame swing because the primary gets more valuable as the objectives disappear. On Crucible of Battle, so Diagonals deployment. And a couple of things went really wrong for me at the start of this game. I got the first turn. You don't want that on supply drop because the end game swing is so big. And then in terms of the order in which objectives were disappearing on another UKTC board, my safe one was disappearing first, and the middle was going to be left at the end. So this in the main suits that kind of stodgy Terminator type build because basically as long as they keep the primary vaguely level, they can then make a big push for the objectives in turn 5 on end of turn and win the game. And I think that was something that both Harley and I were very aware of going into the match. And it meant for me that I had to play the game in a very cautious fashion because I needed to stop that endgame swing or I simply wasn't going to win the game. So I had to simply deny space, spread out, use my cheap assets to stop Grey Knight units dropping into valuable parts of the board, make it so that if they wanted to drop in behind me, they were just sacrificing a unit with the 3-inch deep strike that was then going to die. And I kept things like the Scourge and other Dark Lance shooting in reserves ready to drop down and deal with Dread Knights as and when they appeared, and they did. And I also hunted down all of Harley's scoring assets. So I hunted down the Calidus, hunted down the strike squads, took out the smaller units and the Dread Knights, which meant that by the end of the game, he was down to basically Terminators, which are obviously slower, a little bit easier to manage, and if you can tie them up, aren't going to threaten you in quite as effective a way. And it meant I was building a small lead on secondary scoring, which then takes it to turn 5, where by this stage, the only option I have to actually win the game is to throw my entire army into the middle, go and dance with the 10 Terminators that are getting ready to take the point, and see if that is enough to hold on and prevent the endgame swing. Now, my assessment by about turn 3 was that I would lose this game. I'd managed to trim off the other assets, but the Terminators were still very intact, and I didn't see the way I could actually prevent a very small loss, having built up a slight secondary advantage, then losing on the primary endgame swing. And I think probably if we played this several times, that is what would happen. But in the event, Harley and I were both exhausted. Long GT in the final is always a very tiring game, and we both made a couple of little errors. I hadn't pushed to hit one of Harley's objectives when I probably should have done, and I'd held back. And then Harley, trying to make up his secondary deficit, went after my home objective, which wasn't worth points by this stage, for capture enemy outpost, which meant his Terminators had split up, which meant I did have one turn where I was going to be able to hit just the Drago brick as hard as I could with everything that I had left. So I had Incubi, I had Lilith and Witches, and I had some Scourge. And I basically just rolled very hot, and Harley rolled very poor. Haywire Scourge killed 3 Terminators without any empowerment. They shouldn't be doing that. That's 3 6s on 8 shots. That's ridiculous. And then Lilith and the Witches and the Incubi went right through the Drago squad, which then meant by that point, although Harley could do a little bit of wriggling with his remaining 5-man, which I'd tied up, he didn't have enough to push back and take the central point. So I think we were both caught out by this sudden swing at the end of the game, and this is just one of those bits of luck that you put yourself in a position to hope it can happen, but you cannot rely on those kind of things happening. And again, another really great sporting opponent. Harley took the defeat like a champ because I think we both were fairly certain Grey Knights had this until right at the end of the game. And it was a real smash and grab for the Drukhari. And this is an army that can really perform smash and grabs. I enjoy that, but it's not for the faint of heart at all. So that meant it a 65-54 win, and it all hung on that end of game, whether the Grey Knights could get that end of game sort of points swing, and that took the Drukhari through to the win. So that made this my first GT win, which I was delighted with. I've had a number of GT podiums over the years, usually running something a bit more sort of opportunistic in the meta, kind of Harlequins or Gene Stealer Cults or whatever else. So for me to come back to my genuine favourite army, take it essentially for the joy of it and the fun of it to an event, and then actually be able to take first place was a real vindication of the way I like to play the game and the way I like to go about things. So I was really happy with this. And again, I think it often shows how if you're focused on other things and not overthinking where you're going to end up. I was really just focusing on playing the detachment as well as I could, learning the matchups, enjoying playing the army. And the success kind of came as a secondary thing, often a bit of a lucky thing as well. And I think that's process over outcome. And that's something we really like to emphasize at 6++. I think that's much more important. If you're enjoying the process, building into it and working at it, then success is a nice side effect rather than the goal in and of itself. And I have a whole bunch of analysis coming out of this. And the first thing I was delighted to report was that, this was my first event with the new detachment, but what I found was a lot of the Drukhari kind of fundamentals and instincts from 9th edition, and particularly late 9th edition when Drukhari had been nerfed a bit and no longer had the raw output to just bulldozer anything they played against. You had to be careful and choose when to push, when to hide, when to die for the cause, and when to take your time. All of these instincts are back with Sky Splinter. They work for you again. And this is why I was able to perform at quite a high level with the list, despite not having played much with Drukhari in recent times, because I think the fundamental spirit of the army has been recaptured, with all of its sneakiness, blocking, tying things up, launching a very heavy counterattack at an opportune moment, using precision melee and shooting, but using it very carefully, otherwise you simply get killed and lose. So I think for the Drukhari player, that should be really reassuring. It was really reassuring for me, and it kind of set me up for playing a bunch more events with Drukhari, which is what I'm going to do for the next few months. Incubi and Scourge are fantastic units. The precision and the reach, the damage they can do, the sort of scoring and movement utility that Scourge offer as well as blockers and scorers is all really first rate. And a detachment that gets both of these to sing feels really good. The Beastmaster is simply an incredible unit. I think one is almost auto take for me, because having something that can either block and push in turn one in crucial games, or present a problem that requires so much output to deal with that the enemy has to commit things into range of your guns and your combat, is a really big deal. It's a big slab of wounds, it's cheap, it's quick, and it provides a very useful role whether you're playing defensive or playing offensive, and I think that's really, really good. I loved using the Rapid Ingress Venom. I think the Rapid Ingress Venom coming in helped me to win the Grey Knights game by taking the backfield and scoring a bunch of secondaries. It helped me to win the Demons game by doing similar. In missions or in matchups where you've got enough space to find somewhere good to drop it, don't do it against a horde. It's a really, really useful tool. And people are simply not very good at screening it. It's very hard to deal with because it's got essentially that, that 17-inch move, disembark, and charge threat. You've got to screen it out enough that it can't get over and into your lines with that. It's not easy to deal with. Highly recommend a single Rapid Ingress Incubi Venom. I did not do great with pain tokens at this event. I got away with it a few times. I struggled at times to know exactly where to place the Kronos. And I think the key basically is to place it very centrally, so that at some point or another, Scourge squads or Ravages or whatever else are going to be near it. And then once the shooting has turned into the stabbing and you're getting closer to the enemy, the Kronos can then run up towards one of the points that you're fighting over and offer its regen there. And also that little bit of extra OC doesn't hurt either. I think the entire detachment is awesome. The no Overwatch enhancement is amazing, but I found by far the most powerful tool was the disembark and charge, because I just think being able to suddenly spike the distance you cover, suddenly deliver a huge payload of damage into a place on the board the opponent wasn't expecting it, especially coupled with the ability to then retreat and get back into the boat as well, is very, very powerful. And this is the difference between Sky Splinter and Real Space, in that as much as you have an asset now that works much, much better as an offensive tool, you don't simply have to try and shoot what you can see. You can reach into places you couldn't reach before, and that's a really, really phenomenal tool to have. So yeah, wonderful, really enjoyed it. Can't recommend the detachment enough, and delighted to have taken an event win with it as well. That is it for part 2. So we will have part 3 coming soon. I'll cover a much more intensive competitive experience going to the Goonhammer Open at Leicester and placing 4-2 with several really good, interesting matchups against top players there as well. You can check out more of our Drukhari content on the 6 Plus YouTube, and you can, of course, become a YouTube member for early access as well. Do join our Discord, completely free. Get involved in the Drukhari chat there. And remember, if you are interested in Drukhari mentoring or coaching, you can contact myself or Chris, and we can sort that out for you as well. Get hunting out there. It's a really fun time to play Drukhari. I will see you all again for part 3. Bye-bye.